Okay, I think we're going to get started. There's no microphones on the table there, but I think everyone can hear us. There's a little microphone here. Is this working? Everyone can hear me? Yes?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I guess if you can't, you don't know what I'm asking, so it's not going to work. But just want to welcome everyone here. Good to see everybody. This is, as you know, the 18th anniversary of the September 11th, 2001 attacks, and we're going to do a panel. It's a very special panel, I believe, that aims to address the underpinnings of the ongoing threat of militant Islamist terrorism, a threat that literally exploded onto the world stage 18 years ago today. And it's an honor to welcome our two panelists tonight, Mitch Silber and Jesse Morton. And not just because they both have deep connections to Columbia. Both went to grad school here at CEPA in the 2000s, and Mitch has been teaching a counterterrorism course here for many years now. We both teach the two main counterterrorism courses here at Columbia. But for tonight, we'll also recognize them for the terrific work they're doing, both separately and as a team, in confronting and combating what is by far the most dangerous aspect of the global jihadi movement, and that is its powerful ideological messaging and its ongoing powerful ability to attract smart and sophisticated young recruits. Part of why Mitch and Jesse are here tonight relates to their own personal biographies. And their stories we can all learn something from in this post 9/11 world. And in a moment, they will further introduce themselves and set up their conversation for the evening. But allow me to first spend just a few minutes setting the context for tonight's event, which is about understanding the stubborn nature of the threat of militant Islamist terrorism, which unfortunately is more than alive and well 18 years after it carried out by far the deadliest terrorist attack in world history. And also, tonight is about figuring out what we can do about it, so maybe it's not with us as acutely, 18 years from now. And I believe in order to get there, we need to rethink at least some of our assumptions about the nature of the threat and what we're going to do about it, and the panelists obviously agree with need for new thinking. Just a quick point of personal context. We all have our own stories about where we were on 9/11, because it was one of those events where everyone remembers for the rest of their lives. Where were you when the towers fell? And I have my own story. I happened to be a little bit closer to it, I think, than most people. I was at the time working in the Senate for a New York senator named Chuck Schumer. And on that day, I guess 18 years ago today, I was driving to work, and like everyone else, early in the morning, I heard that one of the towers got hit. And they thought it was an accident, and didn't seem like that big a deal. But as I was pulling into the Senate garage where I had a parking space, I heard a second tower got hit. And that's when I knew, for the work that I was doing, working foreign policy, national security, being briefed on a group like Al-Qaeda even before 9/11, had a sense that everything was going to change, and it did. And that was obviously a pretty tough day. I was with Schumer for the next 36 hours straight. We got kicked out of the offices. We were camped out in a tech office to do some work the next couple of days down in Southeast Washington. Me and a couple other staffers slept on the floor of his townhouse for a couple of nights. And some of you might remember the night of 9/11, this is about exactly this time 18 years ago, a bunch of members of Congress got together on the steps of the Capitol, and they were all meeting there, and some cameras came, and then they sang God Bless America in a pretty iconic moment in American history. I was with Schumer at that point. I was driving him around in my green 4Runner all day, and he heard that there was a meeting at the Capitol, so we drove in with my green 4Runner. You can imagine the Capitol Police and all the other militarized people there that day as I was driving around onto the grounds of the Capitol in my 4Runner with lasers pointed at me, and Schumer waving us in. "Now we're okay, we're going in." So we go into the Capitol, and he joins everyone else, and he sings God Bless America. And there's a famous picture I can't seem to find anymore, but I remember it at the time. There's a big, I think it was AP or New York Times, a big wide shot of the Capitol steps and the members of Congress singing God Bless America. And there's only one vehicle in that picture. It's my green 4Runner on the steps of the Capitol. I still have that 4Runner today, by the way. So I'm there, they're singing God Bless America, and I see Tom Daschle's one of his top advisors. He was a Democratic leader in the Senate at the time, a friend of mine named Mark Patterson, and he walked over to me, had a sheet of paper, he was kind of a mess also, and just showed me the list and said, Al-Qaeda. And he showed me everything. And I found out about it before most people did, but they did some amazing police work to even figure out who these people were, and they had it within 12 hours, which was pretty impressive. But that's my memory. You can see I still get a little choked up, so bear with me. And working in the field a little bit myself, teaching terrorism, teaching American diplomacy, writing about some of these things. So I think it affected all of us and our career paths in different ways. But my purpose is to do a little bit of an introduction, and I want to ask the question, 18 years later, where are we? What's going on? After 2 full presidential administrations, George W. Bush followed by Barack Obama, and 2 different approaches, at least rhetorically, in fighting militant Islamist terrorism. By the end of Obama's second term in 2016, and despite Obama himself insisting multiple times that, quote, Osama bin Laden is dead and Al-Qaeda is on the path to defeat, unquote, when his own Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, gave the administration's final national security threat assessment to Congress in early 2016, Clapper said, quote, Sunni violent extremism has today more groups, more members, and more safe havens than at any point in history, unquote. And that included on the September 11th of 2001. Clapper said in 2016, quote, we face a graver threat today than 9/11 of 2001, unquote. And a more globalized threat. Clapper said also in 2016, quote, violent Sunni extremists have operationally active networks in about 40 countries worldwide. And today, more than 2 years later, 2 years after Clapper's testimony, the problem continues to escalate. According to a recent report by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the number of global jihadi active fighters in 2018 was nearly 300% greater than it was in 2001, the year of the 9/11 attacks. In just 6 countries, Syria, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, and Nigeria, and Somalia, the high-end estimate of foot soldiers totals roughly 200,000. And that does not include growing jihadi networks on the Arabian Peninsula, the Sahel region of Africa, and in South and Southeast Asia, putting the worldwide total well over 250,000. And those are just the folks at the tip of the spear. In terms of global body count, according to the Global Extremism Monitor out of London, deaths worldwide from jihadi violence in 2017 alone was roughly 84,000 across 64 countries, including over 22,000 civilians. So this movement remains radically violent and increasingly globalized. Now, there was much rejoicing last spring after ISIS lost the last patch of territory in Syria in the town of Baghouz, including by the Trump administration, which quickly announced a drastic drawdown of U.S. Special Forces troops operating there. But another hard truth is that the Islamic State is swiftly regenerating itself in the region, now gearing itself up for a long-term fight as a non-state guerrilla and terrorist actor. According to a recent triple Inspector General report by the United States Department of Defense, Department of State, and USAID, despite the loss of its territorial caliphate, Islamic State still has between 14,000 and 18,000 committed fighters east and west of the Euphrates River Valley. The UN actually estimates as high as 30,000, with foreign fighters constituting about 20 to 25% of all Islamic State fighters on the ground in Mesopotamia today. And that's the real long-term problem, the increasing globalization of Islamic State and Salafist militancy in general. Aside from its tens of thousands of fighters inside Iraq and Syria, Islamic State has been expanding its global network even faster than Al-Qaeda in its heyday, with formal and informal affiliates in Afghanistan, the Sinai, West Africa, the Philippines, and other places. Just 3 weeks ago, Islamic State carried out its deadliest terrorist attack in Afghanistan since it announced the formation of its Afghan branch in 2014. That was a suicide attack in Kabul that killed 63 wedding celebrants and injured dozens more. And it's worth noting that the Islamic State Afghan branch is now preparing for a major expansion in that country in the event of a peace agreement between the Afghan Taliban and the Afghan government in Kabul, where it seeks to maintain a safe haven to plot and plan major international terror attacks, much as Al-Qaeda did from the mountainsides of Afghanistan in the 1990s. The bottom line is the global jihad movement, which now includes not just Al-Qaeda as it did on 9/11, but also Islamic State and other affiliated and non-affiliated Salafi jihadist groups, is far larger and far more diffuse than it was on September 11th of 2001. And it's still committed to orchestrating attacks on the scale of 9/11, or larger if they can. And the question I'll end on, and maybe we can pick it back up later, is after 18 years and literally hundreds of billions of dollars spent by this country alone on the so-called war on terrorism, how is it that the threat seems to keep metastasizing in new and seemingly mysterious ways? At least part of the explanation is a profound lack of understanding, particularly in the West, not least of all the United States, of what makes this globalized threat tick. It's a lack of understanding that led the United States under George W. Bush to believe invading and occupying Iraq in the heart of the Arab Middle East would not have radical militant ramifications. But let's remember that the Al-Qaeda threat long preceded the Bush presidency, so he didn't create that threat. It's a lack of understanding that led the Obama administration to hope against hope that with bin Laden dead, Al-Qaeda would simply fade to dust, and the Trump administration to assume that the Islamic State's loss of its territorial caliphate meant the group was on the run along with the murderous ideology it so starkly represents. But none of that accurately captures the true nature of the threat, and it ends up just being a lot of wishful thinking. The fact is, the recent upsurge in Salafi jihadism occurred mostly after Osama bin Laden was dead, and seems to now be revitalized after the loss of the ISIS caliphate. I point to the massive ISIS-orchestrated attacks in Sri Lanka this past Easter as all the evidence you need that a new chapter in globalized jihadi terrorism may now be upon us. The Sri Lanka operation was a perfect mix of Islamic State strategic planning, locally recruited foot soldiers who came from wealthy, elite, and highly educated backgrounds, and were obviously willing to kill and die for the cause, and an ominous message that a stateless Islamic State will now begin actively targeting what it called, quote-unquote, coalition countries, countries it defines as Western countries and any countries that generally align with them. The attack was technically, at least symbolically, it was revenge for the loss of that last patch, that Barghuz town, and they did this attack halfway across the world so the world would notice. Now, it's understandable for Westerners to believe that the loss of a leader like bin Laden or the loss of a tangible territory like the Islamic States would signal the likely end of globalized Islamist movements. But a human face and even some patches of territory was never what made this movement tick. What makes it tick is its underlying ideology, a powerful Islamist ideology that long predated bin Laden and will continue to long outlive him. In fact, it's an ideology that long predates the United States and even long predates the West. Its spiritual foundations were built following the fall of the Abbasid Caliphate in the late Middle Ages, as led by religious intellectuals and radical thinkers such as Ibn Taymiyyah, through the 18th century Arabian preacher Muhammad Abdel Wahhab, through late 19th century intellectuals like Rashid Rida, and 20th century figures like Hassan al-Banna and Sayyid Qutb of the Muslim Brotherhood. It's a simple message of a return to an austere, idealist Islam, free from the impurities of foreign influence, particularly the more recent influence of Western colonialism and the West's strategic dominance in Muslim regions around the world. In other words, the movement has powerful geostrategic as well as deeply held religious underpinnings. So it's an ideology that appeals to many around the world, and one of them is here today, who found that ideology appealing for a whole variety of reasons, and he's here to tell us a little bit about that. And we'll also talk tonight about how pushing back against that ideology in a real way, respecting it, understanding it, seeing it not as something to just dismiss or wave off and hope it goes away, but understanding it and respecting it as a deeply held ideological belief. And we'll recognize that there are no silver bullets in defeating this movement and its powerful ideology. It will require a mix of hard power and soft power, good intelligence and equally good diplomacy, patience and forbearance. But most of all, it will require understanding how it ticks at the grassroots, the level of recruitment, and what we can do about that. Countering this form of violent extremism with moderate messages and clear alternatives to violence will be the first step toward ending what has become a very long war and an increasingly globalized war. And thanks to the excellent work done by these two gentlemen on our panel tonight, I believe that they're offering the starting points of an opening in this kind of direction to start tackling this challenge. To paraphrase Churchill, it's not the end, it's not even the beginning of the end, but thanks to the work of people like Mitch and Jesse and the direction they point us toward, perhaps it is the end of the beginning. And on that, I'll turn it over to the panelists, and I'll jump back in after they're done with the presentation, and then we'll have some Q&A a little later. Thanks.
Thank you very much. That was comprehensive, alarming, and I think it's situated us very well for tonight's discussion, which I think we'll try to keep open as much as possible for Q&A. I see a lot of students in the room, and if you were to look at me 10 years ago, interestingly enough.
In the back, can you hear us? Because there is a mic there.
Okay, you might have to
more.
Yeah, you guys might have to go through it.
Okay. All right. So thank you, Stuart, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you for having me. Yeah, I need to make sure they got that in the back. And thank you for welcoming me here to my alma mater. My name is Jesse Morton, and if you had met me 10 years ago, you might have, if you had been going to grad school 10 years ago, if you're a student here, you might have had me in your classrooms. But you would have found what was going on in the shadows very peculiar, because on the side, I was going by a adopted name of Yunus Abdullah Muhammad. Mitch Silber at the time was well aware of my existence. In fact, I think that there was a bit of a cat and mouse going on at the time that I was a student here with regard to trying to figure out exactly how I was able to operate at Columbia University and be an Ivy League grad student, while at the same time running an organization called Revolution Muslim that was connected to at least 15 different terrorist plots by the time we were done, and in a large manner worked in a collaborative effort with a bunch of American jihadists to really take the message that was disseminated and adopted and promoted by Al-Qaeda and to formulate it in a way that it could appeal to Western citizens like myself. So we Americanized, if you will, the jihadist message and set forth a template that I think continues to haunt us today, largely because when I was active, they understood the Salafi jihadi ideology as more of a backward, sort of archaic and medieval system, but they didn't understand that it can easily be adapted so that it applies into any time and space, and that the principles associated with it are essentially eternal, and that it does have an appeal, not just to the ignorant that are reading Islam for Dummies, but to those that are elaborating and diving into the deep nuances of Islamic theology, eschatology, political science. And some of the classes that I had here were the most beneficial in making me one of the best propagandists in the English language medium that existed at the time. And so I do want to express on the anniversary of 9/11 my condolences. I do have to say, first and foremost, that it's important for me to stress that I have immense regret for what I did, and I don't want any communication that I convey to you today to come across as if it's arrogant or in any way it does not loathe who I once was. There is really not much I can do about my past. There's no way I can do anything about it, but there is things that you can do in a transformative way to sort of, make up for the heinous things you did. And in going forward, I hope that activities like you'll see the stuff that we engage in, my only hope is that in the Islamic religion, as long as the good overcomes the bad, and as long as your repentance is sincere and you die upon what is the true understanding of Islam, then that's what really counts. And I think it's true no matter what religion that you believe in. And so I ask you to bear with me, because I have very serious critiques of where we're at 18 years later, and I have a very keen sort of what many would call an overemphasis on the role that ideology plays when we look at what radicalizes people into violence, and we welcome conversations about that in the follow-up. So again, my name is Jesse Morton, but I was Yunus Abdullah Muhammad, and on 9/11, unlike you, I was asleep when the second plane hit the tower, and I was already a Muslim, had already adopted the name Yunus Abdullah Muhammad. I had converted, having been a runaway, due to very, very, very difficult childhood, and a lot of abuse at the hands of my mother, and a background that's fascinating, because my father is from here, was from right across the bridge in New Jersey, and my roots on my father's side go all the way back. I'm a descendant of John Adams, sons and daughters of the American Revolution. My father's father was supposed to be Supreme Court Justice in the state of New Jersey, but died out of nowhere during his senior year of high school. My father adopted a counterculturalist sort of leftist hippie sort of mentality, moved to rural Pennsylvania to live off the land, went to a liberal arts college, knocked up my mother, had to marry her, and this is where a bad marriage was my fault, though I had nothing to do with it. I suffered greatly because of it. And I ran away at 15 due to severe child abuse in the home, and I say that because increasingly we are seeing more and more link between developmental trauma and the entrance into and commitment to a violent extremist movement. But regardless, having run away and took to the streets, I adopted a far leftist lifestyle like my father's. So I was a hippie traveling around with the Grateful Dead and searching for something to belong to, thinking that tuning out of mainstream society was certainly key, not adopting the corporatist, materialist mentality of the Americans that had abandoned me and failed to intervene while my mother was abusing me, right? I had this internal resentment that I didn't identify until later in life. I thought I was adopting the ideology of the leftist counterculture because I was making a rational choice. I think that's important when we talk about the role ideology plays, because it may think it's a rational choice, maybe it's not such a rational choice, maybe it's rooted in something deeper. And so I'm traveling around, and I'm traveling with the Grateful Dead, right? And I'm like selling drugs on parking lots, trying to get by. I'm living this weird lifestyle where I'm getting high and living like a buffoon, but I'm also reading far leftist and anarchist books of communism and flirting with this utopic world, wanting to tear down the world that I feel has been cruel and harsh to me. It doesn't work out so well because the principles that counterculture movement are built upon are really individual freedom to the nth degree, and I started to suffer from addiction. I started to suffer from not really believing and buying into it, but going along because I had nothing else to believe in. And I found myself incarcerated, and I read the Autobiography of Malcolm X. And it was reading the Autobiography of Malcolm X that resonated with me, because Malcolm's story was a lot like my own. I had protected my sister from abuse, so I had adopted this really serious detachment from concern for myself and an ability to suffer for others. This picture of myself as a person who could sacrifice for a greater cause, was willing to throw myself away in order to, make sure that other people were okay. And Malcolm seemed to have that in his activism, but he had come from this traumatic abuse and traumatic childhood. They used to ship me to sort of special schools where, because I had a high IQ, but I ended up being from the lower class of a rural population, used to send me to an urban school. And I could relate with a lot of Malcolm's story. And then he took to the streets, up the street from here, and became a peddler and sold weed or whatever. And then had gotten arrested and had transformed his life and had taken all of that energy and all of that power and all of that charisma and had thrown it into something that was activism outside of itself, a greater cause. And I felt like that was really appealing. And so when I read the Autobiography of Malcolm X, it set me off on this search for spiritual belonging and an interest in Islam. And so I started to read about religion, but I never would have believed in organized religion. I just had this implicit rejection to it because of the way that I was raised. But I found Islam haphazardly in Philadelphia while I was hustling on the street with a Salafi, quietist Salafi, which practices the apolitical version of Saudi Arabian fundamentalism, which is one of the greatest antidotes to Salafi jihadism in some ways, and there's a discussion to be had there. But this was not a good Salafi. A lot of these people in Philadelphia, they have a community where they go study at the University of Mohammed ibn Saud in Riyadh, or they study in Medina, and then they come back and they're imams in the African American community, and they bring back this austerity. And it works for most people, but it doesn't work. A lot of these people adopt Islam in prison and they come home. And so we were sort of engaging in illicit activity in Philadelphia, and we went through an array of difficulties, and we were told to lay down and that we were going to be arrested, but instead we ran. And he says to me, as we're hiding behind this wall in a abandonment in Philadelphia, just say these words after me and everything will be okay. And he says the Arabic words that are called the Shahada, I bear witness that there's only one God, but Allah, and that Muhammad is his prophet. So I say, I don't know what I'm saying, but I know we get out of trouble. And when he takes me to his apartment in northern Philly, I'm exposed to a woman who's actually practicing the religion, his wife, and she welcomes me with open arms because he tells her I converted, and I'm enthralled. I wake up in the morning, the Quran is on the podium, on my way to the bathroom, and I start to read it, and it says in the first line, this is a book wherein there's no doubt, a guidance for the people of consciousness, al-Taqwa, the Muttaqeen, which is something we'll talk about a little bit later. And I'm completely taken aback, and I convert to Islam. The very next day, I am asked to leave Shakur's house. I have nowhere to go. We threw our belongings belongings and our money on the ground when the police, came to arrest us. And I stowed away on a Greyhound and took off to Richmond City Jail, where I was going to sell fake drugs at a concert in Richmond. And I get arrested for selling false narcotics to an undercover policeman. I know when the drugs come back from the lab, I'm going home, but I'm a white boy without a bond going into a tough inner city jail. And they drop me off on the outside of the cell block, they throw my mattress down, and nobody will let me take a bunk, except for one person. A Moroccan with a kufi on his head. I say, I'm a Muslim. Assalamu alaikum. I don't know nothing. He takes me under his wing, he teaches me how to pray, he gives me structure, he gives me guidance, and everything is good. It seems like now this is destiny. And in fact, I actually believe it was. But at one point, after teaching me how to pray and giving me a shahada, he tells me, go to the shower and make ghusl. Wash your whole body. Come out, sit down on this white sheet, and all of the brothers will give you your shahada, your testimony of faith. So I'll give you a new name. And I hate Jesse Morton at this point. So I'm all about this. So I go, I wash everything. I go and I sit down on the carpet beside him, and he puts his hands on my hands and he looks into my eyes, and I say, I bear witness that there's only one God and that Muhammad is his prophet. And then he tells me, your name is Yunus, because you've been guided and Allah is calling you to the truth. And Yunus, Jonah, was swallowed by the belly of the beast, and he was spit back up onto shore, and he called all of his people, and he was one of the only successful prophets. Your middle name is Abdullah, because you're just a slave of Allah, you're nobody. And Muhammad, which is the best name on earth, and you must emulate this man, and you must learn everything about how he did everything, including how he put on his shoes, and how he brushed his teeth, and how he used the toilet, and in imitating him, you will guide yourself to Allah. And I'm taken aback. But at one point, we were praying in the back of the cell shortly before I leave, and you call the adhan loud, so a man is trying to sleep. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. He says, I'm tired of this. He stands in front of the prayer. And the little Moroccan guy, he tries to move him, and he doesn't move. So he stands up and ends the prayer and starts to fight. And he gets beat up very bad. And I take care of him in the back of the room, and ask him, why did you fight? We were in prayer. And he says, there's a narration attributed to the Prophet Muhammad, that if someone stands in front of the prayer, then gently move them to the right with your hand, and if they don't move, then stand up and fight, for verily they are shaitan. And I'm like, wow, Prophet Muhammad said this? Absolutely. Since Sahih Bukhari, it's authentic, but I'll break down the hadith. Okay, I'm sort of struck, but I'm inclined to take something that gives me this belonging, and so I go with it. And he tells me that there's this black flag that's been raised in Khorasan, which is Afghanistan, according to the jihadists. It's before 9/11. And that it will not be stopped until it reaches Jerusalem. Now, I've been reading Finkelstein and Chomsky, so I'm all about this idea of Jews getting massacred in Israel at the end of times for their aggression against the Palestinians. I'm totally cool with it. I don't know anything about the Taliban. He tells me that they've implemented Sharia law and that the United States will never allow it. So I leave, maybe a week after that, with this new ideology handed to me in a lap and nobody else that believes in it. And I get out and I totally transform my life. I didn't smoke cigarettes, I didn't drink alcohol, I didn't smoke marijuana, I didn't sell any drugs, I didn't travel with the hippies. I went to a Salvation Army. Told them I was a Muslim, and they gave me a bed. And shortly thereafter, 9/11 happened in Syracuse, New York. And everybody flipped out. And so where was I at on 9/11? Very different space than you. It took me a long time to get back to that point, sorry. I was sleeping, and somebody nudges me and says, you gotta come look at this. And I get up, and I look, and I see it, and I don't know if it was intuition or if it was just what I was immersed in by the time. I said, oh shit, we're going to war with the Muslims. I went right back to sleep and didn't care. It didn't even affect me at all. And I was only in the beginning process of my radicalization. And it's still to this day, every year on 9/11, I reflect back to that moment, and I feel it, I relive it, and I was numb. I was totally out of my existence. And I continued to just try to cope and deal with a structured religion that was telling me as a creative soul not to think for myself and just to memorize. But when I go into something, I go all in. And I went all in, right? And I studied this thing as best as I could. And this Salvation Army kicked me out for having Arabic literature in the frenzy that was 9/11. They asked me where I wanted to go, and I said, take me to Manhattan. I ended up ultimately living in a shelter in 145th Street in Edgecombe and walking the streets of Malcolm X as I tried to rebuild my life. And Jesse Morton was getting scholarships to go to undergrad school. If he completed his associate's degree, he was going to get his GED, his high school diploma. Jesse Morton was obtaining incredible things with the stability that was given to him by the religion of Islam. But on the side, there was this other alter ego called Yunus Abdullah Muhammad, who was just dying to come out. And he started preaching on 125th Street against the Iraq War. And he made some connections that led him to a Muslim Day Parade, an annual Muslim Day Parade. And he marches down Madison Avenue and he sees all these Muslims. The NYPD marching band was there to show that they're not anti-Muslim. The majority of Muslims had Pakistani flags hanging out one side of a backpack, American flag hanging out of the other. They were totally aware of the ability for America and Islam to coexist, but Yunus Abdullah Muhammad thought it was sickening. So I get to the end of the parade and I'm standing behind this Pakistani American and he has this Pakistani flag and this American flag and he's waiting for a shawarma and I'm like, what is this? These people have nothing to say about American imperialism. They are nasty. And I look to the left and there's this black flag. And it's this group called Islamic Thinkers Society, which is an offshoot of an organization called Al-Muhajirun, which is run by a Lebanese scholar, not real scholar, but self-proclaimed scholar called Omar Bakri Muhammad, who is a keen leader of the circles around Omar Abdurrahman and even received apparently a fax when the embassy bombings occurred under Osama bin Laden from Al-Qaeda. So he was connected. And he starts a movement in the UK called Al-Muhajirun, which means the immigrants, where they're promoting very serious radical Islam and anti-Western sentiment. And they have an offshoot here in New York City, and I joined them. Long story short, I gravitate through their ranks rapidly, and while I do so, I become a key preacher, and I learn the Salafi jihadi interpretation. I already have the radical leftist political interpretation, and so I infuse the two. And I have an independent, unique voice with regard to being able to promote that. And I recognize quickly that I do have some sort of charisma or ability to put things in a place where I can motivate other people to do things and sort of get movements to formulate. So I established a relationship with Abdullah Faisal, who's a Jamaican cleric who studied in Saudi Arabia for 8 years and who is a certified graduate of Mohammed ibn Saud University in Riyadh. And he's sent to the UK where he becomes a prominent preacher. He radicalizes the 7/7 bombers amongst many others. And then he goes to jail in Belmarsh where I establish written correspondence with him. When he gets out of prison, I am finishing my first semester at Columbia University School of International Public Affairs, and we decide that over my Christmas break, I'm not going home to see family, because I don't really have one. I am going to write the lead article for the very first English language jihadi magazine, which we're going to launch with Samir Khan and Anwar al-Awlaqi's assistants, who's already embedded with Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And we start Revolution Muslim as an organization that is set out to do basically what Al-Muhajirun and the group I was with previously wouldn't, and that is unabashedly utilize the First Amendment and the free speech afforded to us in the United States like no other country on earth, and to walk right up to the line of it and tell the American people that we love Osama bin Laden more than we love ourselves, and that we're supporters of Al-Qaeda, and that there's nothing that they can do about it because we're not afraid to speak the truth. Now, granted, we would have never had the courage to do that in Egypt, right? But it sounded good, made us look really brave. Long story short, Revolution Muslim became something that set very much a template for English language jihadi propaganda. Like I said, we worked with Anwar al-Awlaqi, Samir Khan, all of the big Al-Muhajirun names. What we were able to do was we were able to make a transnational movement in the English language, because English, of course, is a language that people all over the world speak. And so we started English language jihadi magazines. We had a website. We transitioned to social media 2.0. We were some of the first Salafi jihadists to utilize YouTube. We used Facebook. We used Twitter. Ultimately, at the end of the day, we threatened the writers of South Park for portraying the Prophet Muhammad in a bear costume to serve the need to get the media to cover controversial stuff, which is the best tool of recruitment. It's not necessarily social media recruitment that counts. It's getting the mainstream media to cover you, and then the social media recruitment gets traction and people find their way to you. So, long story, I ran away from charges that would definitely be likely to come. after threatening the writers of South Park, and I went to Morocco, where my wife is from, my ex-wife is from, and my two children were born. My second child was born while I was there because I stayed for 9 months. And sorry, I'll be done. And my children, and I live in Morocco during the Arab Spring. And during the Arab Spring, I started to talk to students that I'm training for their GRE and their GMAT to study in the West. And I started to really think about the fact that these are students that really just want the ability to express themselves and to have things that I clearly take for granted. I go to prison. I'm arrested in a Moroccan jail. I spent 5 months in Rabat. I meet Hamid Fizazi, who was a Salafi jihadi preacher who I once translated or helped translate and promote his views. And he had changed, but he couldn't tell me that because they were about to leave him out of prison. He starts writing op-eds in the paper, and for 5 months I read op-eds from a former. And it really shattered me. Go back, housed in 23-hour solitary confinement, where a kind guard in Alexandria Detention Center takes me to the law library each day, and I'm entitled to about 8 hours alone with Encyclopedia Britannica's great books of the Western world, Founding Fathers, biographies, history of the United States, Federalist Papers, other fascinating works, and I start to dive into Enlightenment thinking. And then I go back for 3 days a week, and I'm stuck in a cell with the Quran and the Hadith, and I have to reinterpret the Quran and the Hadith through a post-Enlightenment lens, which was fun because I had spent the majority of my time in Islam learning how to memorize things and not think for myself. Long story short, I was supposed to do 11 and a half years in prison and was released 3 years and 8 months after for cooperating with the FBI, partially in part because some of the students and some of the people that followed my website ended up in Syria as ISIS broke out, and it became apparent that killing Osama bin Laden and the Arab Spring were not going to usher in an era of democracy in the Middle East, and we're not going to end the war on terror. And I was released in 2015, and I've been working to combat violent extremism in one capacity or another since that time. And perhaps the most rewarding aspect of my current reality is the fact that I work now with Mitch Silber, who is a professor here, but is also one who built and served as the director of intelligence, and he'll tell you about that in a moment, at the NYPD, and monitored me for several years. And so ultimately, it is one of the most rewarding opportunities of my life to work with someone who has expertise on the counterterrorism side of things. And we're trying to build out a system that doesn't just counter jihadist extremism, but takes a very innovative approach to countering and combating violent extremisms and their intersection going forward. So I'm sorry for going on for a bit too long, but thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you, Jesse. I'll be brief because I want us to get into some of the substance of what we're talking about tonight in terms of the countering violent extremism effort and the release that we're doing tonight here at Columbia. It's great that Jesse can say that one of the most rewarding things is working with me, because I was one of the people who ensured that he was arrested in Morocco and went to prison. But we've come a long way from there. But you should know, Revolution Muslim, I'm going to read something brief. The disruption and the destruction of Revolution Muslim terrorism network was of critical importance. Through its violent ideology and prowess and radicalization and recruitment in the West, the network was connected to almost 20 American and British terrorists, with plots that included a September 2011 attempt to fly a remote-controlled plane strapped with explosives into the Pentagon, a March 2010 plot to kill a Swedish cartoonist who satirized the Prophet Muhammad by Colleen LaRose, aka Jihad Jane, the May 2010 stabbing of a British member of Parliament, a Christmas bomb plot in 2010 against the London Stock Exchange, the January 2009 targeting of the Chabad Lubavitch headquarters in Brooklyn, death threats against the creators of South Park in April 2010, and a November 2011 lone actor bomb plot in New York City. One member of Revolution Muslim was killed in a drone strike in Yemen, where he had joined Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. Several attempted to leave the United States to fight for Al-Qaeda core and Al-Shabaab between 2007 and 2011. And some joined the Islamic State, as you just heard, in Iraq and Syria during 2013 and 2014. All in all, there were 15 plots and arrests, kinetic military actions related to members of the Revolution Muslim Network worldwide. And at the center of the Revolution Muslim Network was its founder and leader, Yunus Abdullah Muhammad, aka Jesse Morton. So, Jesse was clearly at the center, of this network, of this nexus of terrorist activity. Fortunately, no one died in these plots or attacks other than the drone strike against a terrorist in Yemen. But Jesse, in knowing how to take the ideology and position it for an American audience, had the effect of helping to metastasize the threat in the United States, in the UK, in the English language world. And what we're trying to do together is to try and take that unique understanding of the theology, of the ideology, as well as the American ambit, which is unique, and English language, and turn it on its head and try and take that capability and do good with it. Just briefly, my background, on 9/11, I was in corporate finance in a office building in Midtown when the planes hit, and after the second plane hit, knew that this was not a small plane hitting a building, and evacuated my office. Subsequent, I decided, like I had read about in history, where many people after Pearl Harbor, lawyers and bankers joined the OSS to do some type of contribution or service for America, I wanted to do the same. And how does a corporate finance investment banker do that? Well, it comes to SEPA, of course. So SEPA enabled me to do that, and looking at options in Washington, D.C., in the intelligence community, there was an opportunity to join a startup intelligence agency at the NYPD. And startup and NYPD they're not terms that you would think about together, but it turned out that on the platform of NYPD, with a creative police commissioner and a mayor that backed them to the hilt, and unbelievable resources and capabilities, we're able to create a phenomenal intelligence collection and analysis and counterterrorism program. That frankly, during my time at NYPD, we were able to thwart approximately 18 different plots against New York City during that time period. And they were launched from Afghanistan, and from Yemen, and from Somalia, and from New Jersey, and Queens, and Brooklyn. So not only was it overseas plotting, but it was also local plotting. And the amazing thing that we saw was that in having undercovers and informants monitoring someone like Jesse and Revolution Muslim, is how that message had penetrated American society, was having an effect on American Muslims that people had heretofore thought were immune to that message. And what was the message? The message was the ideology. And proliferating it in English language was what was able to really get it out there in a way that bin Laden hadn't been able to do on his own. Now, as Jesse mentioned, he served his time in prison. He was released, and the question, what was he going to do? And I had followed him, his case the whole way through, and followed his release and what happened afterward. You have to understand, in the UK, where a lot of trends in the UK happen first and come to the US, both on the terrorism side and the counterterrorism side. And in the UK, there was an experiment going on where former extremists, who had also had a similar change as Jesse, had decided that not only were they renouncing their extremism, they, in knowing the ideology and the theology and being very articulate, were taking their message out on the road, and created a think tank type organization called the Quilliam Group, where they were going to combat violent extremism, and they had unique legitimacy. They weren't the government. They weren't a foreign-born imam who couldn't connect with the 20-somethings in the mosque. They were, young people who had gone down that road, almost like someone who had been part of a gang and renounced it, and now is speaking to younger versions of themselves to try and say, hey, listen, I went down that road. That road is a dead end. But in the United States, we didn't have anything like that, and partially because we didn't have anyone who could do those unique things. Understand the ideology, understand the religious theology, and then be able to translate it in English to people around there. And I thought Jesse was that unique person. And he and I decided to partner to try and create a nonprofit that we call Parallel Networks, and our mission is to combat violent extremism. Stuart mentioned there are a lot of tools out there. Some are kinetic, some are intelligence, some are policing, some are soft tools. And countering violent extremism is one of those soft tools. Can you prevent people from going down that road to an extremism? Can you turn them off that road, give them an off-ramp to it? And that essentially is what this is all about. And in the same way that Jesse helped create the first English magazine that was pro-jihadi, now we've created the first English language magazine that's counter-jihadi. And this is our second edition that we're launching tonight. We'll show you some images and talk a little bit about that, but I want to get into the manager's discussion with Stuart now.
No, let's do the,
You wanna do
let's
that?
do the magazine first, yeah.
Show us images?
I'll keep it short.
No.
Oh, thank you again. I'm just going to turn this on. Okay, so this is the magazine that we're actually launching today. And this is the cover of the magazine. Basically, it's called Al-Taqwa. And Al-Taqwa is people of consciousness, I guess would be the best way to translate it. Taqwa is a very difficult term to translate into the English language. But it's beneficial in a sense because it taps into our ability to completely turn the narrative and the ideology of Salafi jihadism on its head. We all know the name Dabiq, right, which is the name that is attributed to a prophecy that ISIS quoted because they had taken over Dabiq, the town in Syria, where allegedly, one of the two towns where allegedly Jesus, or Isa ibn Maryam, may descend from the heavens in order to go out and fight the Antichrist, where Jesus becomes this Muslim. And by conquering Dabiq, it seemed to suggest to ISIS, actually long conversation around this, whether or not ISIS actually believed that they were living in that time of victory, or whether they thought they were living in the first of three waves that would lead to victory, which fundamentally changes a lot of how we see things. But Al-Taqwa is basically stealing their playbook. So Al-Taqwa is based, our first edition, this is our second issue, and Al-Taqwa is based on a hadith that attributes itself to the end of times as well. Only difference is that the hadith that this version, which we launched on June 5th, 2019, which happens to be the 5th anniversary of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi's announcement of the caliphate, is that in a hadith of Sunan Abu Dawud, the Prophet ﷺ, may peace and blessings be upon him, clearly prophesies that after a refugee crisis in Syria, this is in a book, Kitab al-Sham, the importance of Syria and the end of times prophecy, a man will rise and he will claim to be from my family, right? He is not from me, nor I from him, for my people are the people of Taqwa. So the name is taken from an end of times hadith, and what we do is we utilize that in the same way that they used one isolated hadith to outline an entire worldview, which motivated hundreds of people. We're able to reframe it. Now, I will say that when you look at these hadith in the context of what was going on in the period of time historically that they were written down, you can easily, just from a logical historical analysis, refute the validity of the hadith, and all of the scholars of Islam actually do for the most part. But because they exist in books of hadith that are classically attributed in a world where the epistemological reference gets greater with regard to reliance, the further deeper it goes, right? The more emphasis, right? And the more reliability you get, the deeper you go into history. And so this is essentially what we do. We're able to deconstruct the ideology through this magazine. We're able to outdo the graphic design, the quality of the jihadists themselves. And we're able at the same time to, in the same way that ISIS looks at things from a holistic perspective, Mitch and I have been able to understand what few people in the countering violent extremism space get, and that is that only networks can combat networks. So we'll oftentimes see counter-narrative campaigns not as compelling as the magazine that we've developed, but we'll oftentimes see them planted on YouTube with the idea that if you build it, they will come. And so you'll have this former jihadist say, don't make my mistake, I'll put my story out there, and some guy looking for radical content is gonna bump into it. Hogwash. ISIS wouldn't do that. Nobody would bump into it. It needs to be embedded into an ecosystemic or a holistic approach. And so what Mitch and I have done is we've looked at the spectrum of radicalization, and we've looked at prevention. And we've looked at sort of harm reduction and early prevention. And we've looked at intervention, and we've looked at counter-narrative, and we've looked at even recidivism reduction. We're doing experimental work providing services where the government has avoided not providing services to individuals coming home from prison. And we've said that a product like Al-Taqwa, while it looks like it's just a magazine, if you think multidimensionally and holistically like a radicalizer and a recruiter does, you can build out a holistic approach to combating ideology that also fulfills the needs that drive a person to adopt the ideology. And so this is our Light Upon Light.online hub where we house our information. You can see on Light Upon Light that we have independent articles. You can see that we have shapeshifters who are influencers, right? Who are the people that are going to be our Abu Muhammad al-Adnanis, right? Our deputy directors, our Ayman al-Zawahris. Eventually, people in our network will rise that will be the most credible voices. What Mitch and I are building out is a sort of a parallel network is what we call it, where if you are exposed or susceptible or vulnerable or engaged in an extremist ideology and you read the magazine, right, then I don't just have to tell you you're wrong with the magazine, but when you talk to me about the magazine, I can also answer a fundamental question, which is, once I de-radicalize, where do I go next? And so that same energy that you held that pushed you into the extremist movement, understanding that these people are idealists, that they're driven by emotions, and that you can transfer that energy so that a negative radicalization becomes benign or benevolent, if you will, and it can be transferred into something productive, is what happens when you look at this thing through a network combating networks perspective. And so the magazine is actually the very first counter-narrative campaign that is embedded in Telegram. So we've spent 5 years trying to take down all of ISIS's content online and remove it, and we've done a pretty good job at it with algorithmic data collection, but all they've done is migrate to more safe platforms, where we can't identify where they're coming from or who they are. And we can't monitor the dissemination of direct messages and instant chats because now they're encrypted and they're secret chats and they expire, so they don't even stay existent on the phone. And yet there's not one single case of a counter-narrative campaign embedded in Telegram, because we removed them from Facebook and Twitter, and then the caliphate started to decline. And so in a period of contraction, like 2011, why would we want to do anything about the ideology? It's on its way out. In a period of contraction is the time to lay the foundation and the groundwork for the network that can combat and rival in size and scope extremist networks, even when they try to re-expand or reassert themselves. And now, as the international community says, hey, wait a minute, ISIS isn't dead, Mitch and I have spent the past year while they were switching and transitioning into concentrating on right-wing extremism, and we've been concentrating holistically on the intersecting and mutual reinforcing nature of the two, using and developing tools like Al-Qaeda magazine, but also then thinking ahead and being productive in taking the proof of concept and pilot initiatives to do something like developing counter right-wing iterations of the magazine and recruiting former extremists, building a network of former extremists that can then provide relief services for them as well. So we have a 24/7 helpline. This is all done without government support. This is all done at a very grassroots level. We've been fortunate enough to find an amazing funder that has seen the value of our vision. We do this. Mitch does not make hardly any money off of this. He does it for the cause, and I myself am only able to be sustainable. We built this from the ground up, and it's really, we think, a fascinating new way to look at countering and combating violent extremism. We think that it is something that we need, that there is an enormous demand for services that can intervene, prevent, and counter-narrative and counter-message those that extremist networks are providing, particularly now as we enter into a phase where we're replicating some of the mistakes that we made with the jihadists with regard to the way that we're dealing with the threat posed by far right-wing extremism. And I think that what we're doing at Parallel Networks is we're setting a precedent upon which we can establish proof of concept and then build that out so that we are in the trenches and in the shadows providing the types of services that we need. And I finally close by saying that I think that one of the greatest ways that we can deal with the threat, an existential threat, and nobody likes to say that, but I do believe that the jihadist war that was waged on us by Osama bin Laden is an existential threat in the long term, because he is waging a war of attrition and always has been. And we have been trying to fight a war that we can end next year. And Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, in his recent release after losing the caliphate, called it a war of attrition as well. But I don't think that we're risking at this point giving the world a global caliphate in the wake of our destruction. I think that what we're facing now is the rise of authoritarianism, disregard for individual freedom and liberty, and the totalitarian state that comes across and has sat back for the last 18 years and has benefited watching us get stuck in quagmires like Iraq and figure out how to deal with this. And I also think that the way to deal with that is to look at the way that ideas manifest themselves in reality, and to think about the role ideology plays in extremist movements. And so we're thinking like this. It's a basic overview, and I guess we'll kick off the conversation now about an array of concerns that surround around that. Thank you.
do you have anything to add about the magazine? See if people can hear us now from the table.
Sure.
Yeah.
So in this issue of the magazine, we're trying to.
No, you can sit down. Just keep your voice up.
Okay.
Either way.
I'll do both.
Okay.
We have two formers, so we're giving voice to people who've also turned around their lives in the way that Jesse has. One of them we call America's first foreign fighter. He's an individual from New York City, from Long Island, who radicalized to violence, traveled to Afghanistan, and actually joined Al-Qaeda, and helped Al-Qaeda plot against the Long Island Railroad train station in November of 2008. Was arrested in Peshawar, served time, changed his mind, flipped, worked with Western intelligence agencies, now released, and as Jesse mentioned, we're working with some of these people who have served time in jail and trying to get a new life, get some type of life going. And so, Brian Neal Vignes wrote about what led him to join Al-Qaeda, what led him to leave Long Island, how did he change his mind afterward. Similarly, we've got another person in there, a person named Jason Walters, who's an individual who grew up in the Netherlands, the child of an American serviceman and a Dutch woman who converted to Islam as a teenager, and he and his brother and their group were involved in the assassination of Theo van Gogh in 2004 in Amsterdam because Theo van Gogh had supported this provocative movie called Submission, which talked about Islam and had nude images of women and Islam together. Anyway, Jason Walters had an experience like Jesse did in prison, changed, but his younger brother didn't. His younger brother stayed involved in jihad and in fact traveled to the caliphate, killed in the caliphate with his wife. So you've got someone who's talking about how he changed his life, plus also what happened to his brother. And the idea is having these testimonials in there, might resonate with people and frankly give people some pause before they go down some of these roads. And as Jesse was saying, the whole idea of the magazine is, you can put out a magazine, people will read it, maybe the article changes your mind, but it should be a trigger for interaction. So we're interacting with people on Telegram, on Facebook, all the different social media platforms. And we've been involved in dialogues with people who saw the magazine and reacted to it. And that's exactly what we want, because you're not going to change somebody's mind with just one article. There's got to be a dialogue. And Jesse, is among the people that we have on the other end who's interacting with the people to try and combat, challenge their ideas. So there's a little more detail in the magazine.
I want to open it up to the audience. There's a ton of people there. I'm sure there's some great questions, and we'll manage those things. I have a quick one, kind of technical side of counterterrorism. I got a bunch of my terrorism students peppered throughout the audience here. The stuff you're talking about, and I know a little about it. I've known Mitch for a long time. Where are you getting the funding for this sort of a thing? This is private sector stuff, right? Donations and different sourcing.
Private sector, but a particular nonprofit who specializes in countering extremism, and this group, the Counter Extremism Project, as their name suggests, this is their bread and butter, and they've been, as Jesse mentioned, tremendously helpful in helping this. And the reason why we have to go that route, frankly, which I think is maybe where you're going, is that the U.S. government hasn't figured out funding for these types of initiatives.
Yes, I'm going to go a little bit, exactly right. Conventional wisdom is counterterrorism is government.
Right.
But what we're discussing today is really a big social, ideological, global challenge. And as Jesse talked about, you were sort of born and bred in the Chomsky and anarchism and Malcolm X and sort of counterculture, which turns into anti-West. And, there's a lot of commonality between some jihadis who convert to Islam, who come from a far left perspective, because they're fighting the West, not because they're Islam, they're born and bred in Islam. So there's a lot of commonality in that. So it seems like the world is dealing with a lot of these counter status quo, counter, if you want to call it, counter global order movements these days. You have white nationalist movements that are springing up that are emulating a lot of what you're talking about. There's a lot in common between the white nationalist right and the jihadi left. They're all fighting the same democracies. They're all fighting the same global order. They're all fighting secular states with a vision of a utopian religious outcome. You have nationalism on the rise in the world, with China in particular. Understandably, it's a rising power that's sort of flexing its muscles in what was a Western global order for the last 70 years. It seems like the West, and you talked a lot about, getting enlightenment by reading about the Enlightenment. I think we could all do well by thinking about what the West has to offer, what liberalism does have, and the virtues of free speech, which you talked about exactly correctly, which it has dangers involved. Yelling fire in a crowded movie theater is something we have to deal with in an open society, but it also still is the best way to organize, including Muslims who want to live a peaceful life, which is the vast majority of Muslims in the world. There's a lot, and they're not necessarily going to abide by a Jeffersonian democracy, but there's a lot to be learned from Enlightenment and to incorporate that within different political cultures and different ways of thinking. So there's nothing wrong with looking back at counter ideology also being big, broad, global ideologies, fighting against those that are sort of trying to tear down the liberal order, which has its faults, But it seems to me like the private sector is a big part of this fight. And that goes against the counterterrorism, conventional wisdom. You were fighting terrorism with the local agency, the NYPD. I was in government. This is what we think of as counterterrorism. My counterterrorism class, the whole second half is all counterterrorism about, what governments are doing to fight back against these non-state actors. But it seems like we're really in a moment now where it's an all hands on deck fight against these dangerous ideologies. And it seems like these private sector movements, social media, counter narratives, counter networking, countering bad networks with good networks, stuff like that is not just going to come from government. And I'd say one thing further, I think Jesse would agree, if you start getting government funding from the US or from the Europeans or even from global organizations like the UN, that might actually taint your organization for being, just sort of parakeets of the capitalist system or the West or whatever it might be. You're almost better off with more private sourcing, private funding, so it's grassroots, legitimately grassroots stuff. It just plays better as a counter propaganda. That's just my feeling on it.
Yeah. Well, two points on that issue. One was that this group Quilliam in the UK, once it became known that they were receiving funding from the British government, exactly, it became tainted because he who pays the piper calls the tune. So they lost some of their legitimacy. And the other problem the U.S. government has, why they haven't stepped in, and this is the discussion that we had with the Obama administration, is that this is not only is it politics, but it's religion, and the U.S. government doesn't get involved because of separation of church and state, to comment on what is the right interpretation of Islam or not. So sort of the reaction was to step away from the whole thing of it. So I'm not sure where U.S. government will come in the future on CVE.
We penned a lengthy piece in Lawfare blog where I think that there's a role for government to play, but at the level of prevention and the ideology, they should probably stay away from it. But there's only one way to create an alternative to interdiction and investigation, right? Which is the development of mechanisms for intervention. And also then recidivism reduction for terrorism-related offenders coming home. So we like to prove concept, and I think that government has a space to play in that. And arguably, though many people push back against governmental role in intervention, they also complain when the only recourse and the only tool in the toolbox is investigation. So there's a serious contradiction amongst critics that pose problems with governmental involvement in CVE, and it is a conundrum. But when we look at what's worked. So the United States did in 2017, finally, after the Obama administration started to get it off the ground. The Trump administration released $10 million worth of grants that have just expired in August of this year, and they were at all levels of the CVE spectrum. If you were to look at what counter-narrative work, the types of stuff Mitch and I have done with our great partner, in the private sector, if you looked at the outcome of that work, you would see that it was abysmal because government bureaucracy causes delays, and by the time they got money in the hands of those that were counter-narrativing, the threat was no longer a call to come join us. it was a call to kill at home, but all of the narrative was focused on the proposal that was written at the time that was, we're going to combat the threat of people traveling abroad to do X, Y, and Z. So when you look at measurable outcomes, you see that the counter-narrative work the government funded, the highest video that they produced with $600,000 worth of funding, has 85 views, because it's a, if you build it, they will come approach. And I think that's what we're trying to transition. I think it's a whole of society approach, which is easy to throw around, but the only way we'll be able to get an alternative to investigation and interdiction is if we can get some sort of backing that would allow an organization like Mitch and my own to go in there and be put on alert that there was a risk that was mounting, reach out to them and see if they were open to an intervention. And then it's very wise for us to develop funding and mechanisms to provide support services for people coming home from prison with terrorism-related offenses. 90 cases are coming home in the next 5 years. So I think there's mostly private, yes, because it's flexible. But there are areas on the spectrum of CVE or counter-violent extremism that will need government involvement and that we should seriously consider.
Out of curiosity, did you know of Abu Musab al-Suri? Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, Jesse.
Because you're such an
No, you did.
articulate
Yeah.
ideologue.
But Jesse, was that? Did you?
So at the time when we
I think it was the Global Call to Islamic Resistance.
Global Islamic Resistance.
Yeah, and it was
call to Global Islamic
right. It
Resistance.
was a really big document.
It was 850
Yeah.
pages in Arabic, 1,200 pages translated into English. I don't know.
That was the
who
90s also.
I don't know who the hell did that job, but it was translated. Yeah, so Abu Musab al-Suri was the strategic thinker of Al-Qaeda, and so Al-Qaeda is faced with this problem where they're getting decapitated abroad in their sanctuary, and so Abu Musab says, it's not a problem, let's take a leaderless resistance model, which might sound familiar because it's a model that was adopted by a right-wing extremist called Louis Bean.
Invented.
Right? And so it was totally extremisms, and we can't emphasize that enough. But basically Abu Musab's contention was that every Al-Qaeda supporter where they were was supposed to convey the message as much as they were able. And that the movement would become a brand and a decentralized ideology that would sustain itself because, as he wrote it, ideas are eternal, right? And they understand that. That's why it doesn't matter how many fighters are left after you destroy the caliphate, because the ideas are still there and the next generation is already groomed. And we keep counting numbers, our metrics, Rumsfeld's metrics. Are we killing, capturing, or dissuading more terrorists than they're recruiting in the madrasas? Not a very good metric because we have to think things through. So Abu Musab sort of promoted this decentral. So here's American kids reading the forums of the jihadists, and we see Abu Musab's translation into everybody promote the ideology as much as you can where you're at. And I'll end with just saying this. Imagine what that does to a kid who's living in the United States of America that can say anything they want. And so we were like, okay, well, the options are endless.
Exactly. Okay, let's open it up, and if you don't mind, just let us know who you are, and we'll, I know who you are, but tell everyone else who you are.
Jake, second year ISP student. I really respect what you guys are doing. That's amazing. I didn't know that existed. That's awesome. But to what extent, so like radicalization.
Microphone, so keep up your questions also, if you don't mind. Thanks.
Radicalization, from how I understand it, has a lot of pizzazz. You got like heroism or salvation or die for a cause. That's got like a lot of pop that I think attracts a lot of people. To what extent, what is your guys' message besides, regret or I don't know?
Well, I can tell you that, I mentioned this American foreign fighter, Brian Neal Vinyas. He can say, hey, listen, I bought that. I bought that story, and I went to Afghanistan, and I went to the camps. And let me tell you, number one, it's boring. It's not exciting. Number two, I didn't even get involved in any of the action, that treated terribly. Number three, the ISI was manipulating me. There was a lot of backbiting among the different groups. This wasn't the glorious, heroic, mission that I was on. This was ridiculous, and in fact, in the end, before I got captured by the police, I was already thinking about giving it up. So you have some personal narratives. Someone went there, saw it, did it. But it's tough. That does appeal to people. And I always say, you know, it's like when you're watching those commercials for the Marines during football games on a Sunday. The guy's on a horse, he's got a lance, he's a knight, and you know, he's vanquishing the dragon, and he stands up and raises his arm. Who wouldn't want to be doing that? The jihadis are playing the same game, just inverted, right? They want you to be jihadi special forces, not, you know, U.S. special forces. It's a powerful, appealing narrative that's tough to. It's tough even if somebody says no, it's not that. But you're right, that is an appealing end goal for people to aspire to.
And quickly,
Okay.
real. It's really difficult to emulate the same sort of neurological processes that are associated with the appeal of violence to the developing brain. But it is possible when you think of what happens inside of you when you see a story of Martin Luther King or Mahatma Gandhi or even the Prophet Muhammad. If told in the right way, you can experience the same sort of dopamine release and stimulation from nonviolent resistance. So our campaign says control the space between stimulus and response. Because I know jihadists, when they sit alone with their anxiety, they're not righteous, right? And alter that course so that you can address those grievances, and we acknowledge the grievance. Sometimes the grievances are real. It's how you address them. And then highlight the fact that everything you said you were going to build only destroyed and cemented what you were trying to defend. You wanted to fight against Bashar al-Assad, the oppressor in Syria. You massacred your own population. You destroyed your infrastructure, and he's thriving, right? America's on its way out. Alhamdulillah, Russia's going to come in and occupy your territory, and China wants to rule. They want to come into Syria and build some high-speed maglev train. That's great. Look at how the Uyghurs are doing, and their Islam is really popping off, right? So then you say to them, like, okay, so that's great. You hate the West. What's the alternative vision? And that's what Mitch and I are trying to progressively develop, which networks take time to seed, they take time to root. And we've only been up and running publicly with Light Upon Light for 4 months. We've attained a lot. And the collective consciousness that's formulating behind closed doors is great. Like, we have 8 former right-wing extremists, 3 victims of extremist attacks, beautiful people, interns, volunteers, podcast producers, people that are unaffiliated with anything to do with violent extremism that call us and they're like, hey, I saw you on TV, I want to do something, what can I do? Well, you know, we need help with social media. And everybody is collectively gathered on Twitter groups and on Telegram groups and on email groups and getting people where they want to go. And there's this consciousness forming, and there's an open invitation for anyone that wants to participate. Because only networks can combat networks. And what you do when you join Al-Qaeda, well, with Al-Qaeda, they grill you and they'll teach you if you don't have the ideological understanding, you can't get through the first phase, right? You can't pass the filter. But with ISIS, they take any swinging whatever, right? And you can do it, and they'll find a place for you. Typically suicide bombing, and preferably just walking out the street and macheteing someone. Grammel, it would be great, right? This is a metastasizing threat that's grown more violent. But you can create, hypothetically, it's a hypothesis that we can create a parallel network built on antithetical principles to extremism that provides the same sense of meaning, identity, significance, and purpose extremists offer their recruits, and only networks can combat networks. So then, in a period of expansion, you're prepared to go against that heightened concern and heightened attention and heightened appeal of the recruitment.
Are we going to stick left and then center right? So let's keep going on the left side just for briefly.
I'm Sammy, second year ISP student. So in presenting a counter narrative to Social Magazine, the first thing I thought of is that there has to be some degree of receptivity on whoever is reading that counter argument. So some willingness to change their belief, to challenge what they know, which certainly there's a portion of jihadis who are maybe able to take the counter argument and change, but there's also a large portion who I would think are completely non-receptive to that. So is this just the first step in countering that ideology, maybe just getting to those people who are willing to hear out a counter argument? And then, as you mentioned, this to combat violent extremism is combating an ideology, not just a singular person. So then how do you get at kind of bigger problem with the ideology? People aren't willing to hear the argument.
So with Al-Qaeda, we released, and here's a principle of terrorist recruitment. It's not about how many people are dead, it's about how many people are watching. Statement from Bruce Hoffman, and all of you have probably read it in your counterterrorism studies. So what we did was we reverse engineered the process. Wall Street Journal op-ed, Washington Post coverage, Voice of America coverage internationally, and then we launched it into their network on Telegram, right? And they have to respond because it's in the news. And so when you think of intervention, we're like, okay, the susceptible and the vulnerable that's flirting with the ideology, that's where intervention should occur. No, networks are weakest at their hubs. We forced the hubs to respond to the magazine, and we were in their rooms. They were so frustrated because we had taken a volunteer hunter who tracks Telegram online. We had 8 burner phones with 16 different numbers. And every time they kicked us out of the rooms and banned us, we'd pop back in with another number because we had been stalking them for a month before we launched. And the head of a very small network, the chief propagandist for Greenbirds, which is the most classic Telegram channel, had to go back and forth with me. And he got humiliated. And it's all screenshot, 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 screenshot. So what do we do today? We go back in when they open their new room and we post the old chats. Would you like to continue the conversation? Crickets in the wind. But in the course of that discussion, we also got him to communicate with us independently, right? And so he hates us, no problem. But when you attack the hub, the people, somebody's not gonna say, I changed my mind because of your argumentation. But you're attacking the hub, which is important, and you're changing the conversation. And we never tried to look for the susceptible and recruit them and brainwash them. We adopted a statement from Ibn Taymiyyah that was, the object of the da'i, the one calling to Islam, is not to make everyone accept the truth, it's to make the truth accessible to those that seek it. So like I give you one example, the star of Rukmini Kadamachi's Caliphate podcast sees the magazine on Telegram, comes over to Twitter, where I can easily be found, and says, you're gonna end up decapitated, the Dota's gonna get you Bakia. Right? And I go, okay, well, let's talk in DM. And I hit him in DM, and I'm like, you guys always throw threats around, but when I was active, we had to provide Islamic evidence for what we said. Can you please give me Islamic evidence and talk to me like I am deserving of evidence before you threaten to chop my head off? Oh, and by the way, how are you doing now? How's your reintegration? So within 2 lines of tweets, I'm doing good, and I want to talk about myself and my personal life, and we don't need to talk about ideology anymore. And now we're very close, and he was essentially re-radicalized by a mistaken understanding of how a person should be supported when they return to the caliphate, and we're filling that void, I think, rather effectively. And that's just one anecdotal piece. This is a pilot initiative. This is something, we have a team of 5 on this one.
But we're dropping these into the hardline channels, Telegram channels, where we're in discussion groups where, as Jesse said, we're challenging them. And if you're the most articulate pro-jihadist in that channel, there's sort of an obligation to respond to it. And you're right, we may not change that person. We may change or cause doubt in a 17-year-old who's in his basement looking at this stuff when his parents are asleep at night. And maybe that person is an easier flip for us, or at least a challenge. But ultimately, because it's going into the channels where they are looking, Greenbirds and others, and in fact, for the first edition of the magazine, we played a bit of a trick on the jihadists. We created a bunch of false accounts on Twitter and Facebook and Telegram and said, hey, on the 5th anniversary of the Caliphate, we're going to be releasing the next magazine. Bad Jihad magazine, right? And that's what they're all expecting. And then on June 5th, we put it in there, and wait a second, this is the exact opposite message, to try and provoke them in a sense, and that's why Jesse got threatened to be decapitated. But mission accomplished. At least
This is the objective
They
measurable outcome.
did to you what you did to South Park.
Exactly. So, yeah, exactly.
2 more from the left. 1, 2.
Okay, Tony Coleman, Earth Institute and former MP in the UK. Thank you for your reference to the Quilliam Foundation, which has been successful, and despite the fact it gets UK government funding, has not lost its credibility. And do you follow that up? My question was really about funding. How did you, Jesse, in your work, get funded? The view, obviously, is that the funding of the jihadist Wahhabist movement is coming out of the Middle East, particularly out of Saudi Arabia. Is there a situation where, using your background, Sarah, in international finance, we could close off those funding channels and seek, if you like, to be able to close down the madrasas, not just in Pakistan, that happened last week, but also in terms of what's happening in Saudi Arabia? Funding.
Yeah, well, listen, terrorism finance has been front and center as a priority for U.S., UK, Western governments. Unfortunately, when you have that conversation with Saudi Arabia, there's a hierarchy of different asks from the Saudis, and it's one of the asks. And I think they have, responded, to some degree. But some of that funding, especially as it crosses over into religious material, they are more reluctant to defund. Now, with the Crown Prince, MBS, many faults that he has, one of the bright spots about him is that he said he's not going to fund some of these Saudi NGOs like the Muslim World League and the IIRO, which were sort of the chief proliferators of the ideology, sending Qurans to Bosnia, to Zimbabwe, to Zanzibar, and everywhere in between that had a Saudi variant interpretation of the ideology. He's said that they're not going to do that anymore and cut back on that. So that's a positive, potential outcome as long as he follows up on that.
How was Jesse funded?
So during our heyday, in the beginning, we started really small. So we'd go to every Friday, we would go to a different mosque in New York City, and we'd scream and we'd shout and we'd ask people to support us and give us donations for someone who donated DVDs of Sheikh Abdullah Faisal's lectures. And so we'd leave with several $100s. And none of the imams discredited us for much time, a long time. We were welcome outside the mosque. That's what a lot of people don't understand. But then as stuff started to get more concerned with the domestic threat of leaderless resistance and lone wolf terrorism, still none of the mainstream imams that should have refuted us online cared a bit about us. Nobody spoke out against us. We would contact Hamza Yusuf and the key moderate preachers and argue with them repetitively behind closed doors, Swave Webb, and none of them ever approached us. It's important to say. It's the truth. They never came out publicly against us, and even at the local 96th Street, until they hired an Indonesian imam who was progressively thinking about this thing as a real threat, we got coffers of donations here domestically just from cash handouts. Wow. But we also, interestingly enough, and I don't know for sure, so we had PayPal, we had Western Union. People would call and they would email, and then Abdullah Faisal refuted, or he had a debate with a Catholic priest on live Jamaican television. And it was in a humorous exchange that we turned into a YouTube video. As you can still log on to it, Abdullah Faisal refutes Christian bishop. If you tallied up all the views, still to this day, it doesn't violate terms of service infringement. So it has millions and millions and millions of views. But at the end, it says contact Revolution Muslim to buy the DVD. And we would sell the DVD and swing the DVD. And then we'd get emails from Dubai, Saudi Arabia from time to time, but when they donated, it wasn't a $50 donation. And we had a consistent contributor from Canada to this day that confused. Even when I started to cooperate, we could never figure out who it was. And it seemed to be someone who was connected, and every month religiously to Abdullah Faisal, X amount of dollars would fly in from Canada and hit and go to him. So in some ways, I don't know. And it's even more puzzling now with all of the new cryptocurrencies and mechanisms of shifting money around.
By the way, most people don't know that the Saudis Wahhabis were funding these mosques in Sri Lanka that had been moderate for generations, and they turned more radical. They had an easier chance of recruiting because the money was coming in and that ideology was penetrating in sophisticated society there. One more on this side, yes?
Sure. Dan Sorick, first year ISP student. So on the topic of scaling and reaching out more people, what role do you think that mosques or organizations that represent Muslims should play or can play? Maybe you want to think about that both like on a moral level, or even also on a practical level, like as you see your work going forward in the next like 4 months, year?
So the problem in the American mosque community is that countering violent extremism has been delegitimized by a very small group of people that are completely misinformed, conspiratorial, and completely adulterate the work of those that they quote and cite, but nobody investigates it further. So the idea is that CVE is about investigation. It's about spying on the Muslim community. It's about waging a war against an ideology.
Includes with the government you're talking about.
Includes with the government, right? And so the problem is it's a very small subset. It's predominantly 2 think tanks. It was transferred from the UK by one single professor that now is a professor at NYU that has brought the conspiracy theory that prevent is this, and when Obama tried to do it here in 2011, massive mobilization. So if you mention countering violent extremism to anybody in an American mosque, they'll immediately think you're a spy.
Yes.
And this is really, really, it shows you that, and it's the same way that the American Muslim community in general, so the majority of Muslims in this country are not mosqued. And if you talk to them, the reason that they're not mosqued is because it is a very politicized interpretation of Islamism that runs the majority of the board of directors. It's changed a lot. And it doesn't mean that everybody that's Muslim Brotherhood is trying to overthrow the Western government, but it does mean that there is a politicized interpretation of Islam, and in so many ways, that politicized interpretation of Islam has merged with the far left to create this conspiracy theory that Islam is under some sort of attack, and that people like Mitch, when they were actively doing what they were doing, right, were setting innocent Muslims up, and they look at criminal complaints, which are 3-page documents that show enough evidence to charge someone criminally. The cases never go to trial because they're guilty, right? And then they base the scant evidence because they don't want to reveal tradecraft, so it's not in the complaint. And they never go to trial, and then they say this was clearly entrapment because an informant was involved. I myself had to move my home because I worked as an informant, because when I was released from prison, my old sheikh actually believed that I had just won an appeal. And I'm outed in the Washington Post by a young reporter as an informant in the field and have to move. And these people were going to travel abroad, and if they couldn't travel abroad, they were going to behead somebody at home. They had the equipment to do it. They had the plan. They had a collective of individuals that was meeting in the backyard of a mosque. And the Washington Post portrays it as a clear case of entrapment and outs me as an informant. So I have to drive around Northern Virginia in an old 1991 Subaru because I'm trying to reintegrate from prison. And I have to move and relocate with the help of the FBI because I'm outed, and the lawyer is told, if you say his name again, you're going to be sitting where your client is. The reporter runs with it. The attorney ends up getting fired from the case. The kid pleads guilty because he's guilty. And here I am, almost risking my life to conduct an investigation, right? And now I'm stigmatized to the point where when I go into the mosque, traitor, kafir, right? And this is really and it is real. It is not me, complaining. This is a real stigma, but there's good things happening. I just, for example, got a conversation at a mosque in Houston with Sheikh Walid Baisuni, one of the leaders of the American Muslim community, and he was happy to house me, and the conversation went well, and it was very productive, and it was very civil, and nobody pushed back. But they forced people that are doing very good work to not take money to do CVE. But then they complain about investigation with no alternative.
Let's move to the middle, yes.
Alex, first year ISP student. Just curious to get either one of your thoughts on sort of the situation with the camps in Syria right now being a perfect hotbed for radicalization, and kind of the best way to maybe address that issue. I know there's talk about trying to repatriate people. Obviously you have most of those camps are wife and kids. Yeah, just curious to hear your takes, thoughts.
Yes. Look, it's a little bit like, the U.S. ran Camp Bucca, in Iraq, and that was sort of viewed as the graduate school for terrorists, and by having everybody housed together. This is, as you say now, families, and everyone was sort of scooped up, in Iraq, and as the caliphate in Syria, as it collapsed. For Westerners who are there, my belief is they should be sent home and they should be prosecuted. Problem is that, in the U.S., the rule is that if you go and join a foreign terrorist organization, you are guilty of material support. What's the material support? Yourself. You provided yourself as the material. So that's 20 years. Just by you being there. Don't need a lot of evidence. UK, Germany, France, Scandinavia don't have this law in the books. The UK is working on some legislation that looks at, outlawing going to certain territories. So how do you bring these people back? You probably can't do it all at once. You probably have to do it in phases, and you probably have to get testimony from people in the camps about other people and use that as sort of your leverage to be able to convict the people who are most guilty, and with some type of promise for others that they're going to have much more lenient treatment. And then you've got those who are Iraqis and Syrians in those camps. And for them, you need some type of rehabilitation program that's there. But obviously, certainly on the Syrian side of the border, very difficult to do because you've got non-governed space. On the Iraqi side, at least a functioning government, so maybe you can do some type of rehabilitation there. But that's, it's not a perfect solution, but at least it's better than just letting this fester there, because that's, where ISIS 2.0 will emerge from.
Ali Sufyan from the Sufyan Group issued a very good statement today about that. Al-Qaeda is not just a conundrum and a problem, it is also an opportunity, I think. And we have an article in the magazine that looks at 18 years into the war on terror and looks at Mosul as an opportunity for not just rebuilding physical infrastructure, but looking at the importance of intellectual infrastructure. And I was just downtown today with an organization called Ideas Beyond Borders that we might partner with, that has allegiances with universities in Iraq and is translating secular humanist works from English into Arabic, sending them in for free, like Steven Pinker authorizing translation, and then working with professors there to put these new humanist ideas out there in Arabic. And they're also translating Wikipedia documents into Arabic. And we have a proposal to do the same thing with Al-Taqwa with ISIS's newsletter, Adnaba, where we would show the alternative formulating in those universities with Ideas Beyond Borders, and then Mitch and I would dissect whatever area of the ideological cases being made by ISIS in their weekly newsletters. And so we think that we're establishing some sort of precedent.
Middle, okay, go to the right, please.
Kind of building on that.
You are?
I'm a Korea first-year MPA student. I think of Ayaan Hirsi Ali made a movie submission with Theo van Gogh. I'm actually from the Netherlands, so it was very relevant for me. Part of her story is that the Western Enlightenment ideas, which you mentioned, Stuart, are not compatible with Islam. And I'm just wondering, what's your idea about this? Is there always going to be a tension between Islam and Western Enlightenment ideas, or is there a way to make them compatible?
That's a lecture in and of itself.
Right.
I think for the sake of time and for the sake of the fact I've already been somewhat long-winded, I think I'll refer you to an article in Al-Taqwa 1,
Okay.
Dialogue of Civilizations in the plural, that there is no such thing as Western civilization or Eastern civilization or Confucian civilization, that we are all Bani Adam, which is a concept from the Quran, quite compatible with humanist understandings, that we are all one tribe, and that Allah created us in different colors and cultures and tongues in order to get to know one another. So if there's a principle, and that's from the Quran, so if there's a principle that is derived and that could be applied, and if the entire worldview that you build is built on that one verse, right, then right there you see that Islam can be interpreted from an enlightened, quote-unquote enlightened lens.
Well, great questions that, like you said, we can have a whole new panel on. A couple of last ones here. Yes, you are.
I'm Ken, and I'm a retired teacher. The war on terror gets started with the towers coming down. Tell me, how do you understand the towers coming down now that there's so much evidence about controlled demolition from the architects and engineers? It's like solid, hard evidence. How do you deal with that?
deal with it because that's not true. That's how I deal with it. I was there. I was in government at the time. I've seen everything on these attacks. That's absolutely preposterous.
So there's
That's how I deal with
there's a
it.
movie that you can watch online. It's called Knowledge is for Acting Upon in Arabic. It is imagery shot by Al-Qaeda of Osama bin Laden training the 19 hijackers, telling them exactly how they would do things. It is their last wills and testaments. They tell you how they describe the plot, and they show the astonishment that they themselves had when the towers collapsed.
And 2 weeks later,
So-
bin Laden was
right.
also on tape. He would have had to been part of that internal conspiracy if what
Well,
he said.
the 9/11 truther framework is that bin Laden was created by the CIA and he's an actor.
So we're skipping over.
forgot that.
No, we don't really need to hear from you. You kind of made your point. You need to stop. You're just being insulting.
No,
No, it's okay. But I think that for the sake of time, if you want to have this discourse, we can. I'll give you my personal email because it's a long back and
Good.
forth.
I like
Cool.
it.
Yeah,
Okay.
but thank you for your
Oh,
question.
thank you.
Yes, and then over to the back left. One on the back.
I'm Ben. I'm a master's student in the history department. I was curious about if you guys have any plans to combat extremism on the far left. There's been a lot of talk about sort of the ties between far left extremism and Islamist extremism, and I feel like there's a lot more violent rhetoric and action that we're seeing right now from the likes of fringes of Antifa and things like that. So I was wondering if you guys have any plans for an issue coming up to combat that.
So, I mean, I think it's important, but I do think that let's ground this in one statement. There has not been, other than that killing at that softball field in Virginia, a far leftist attack that was violent extremist in nature that led to death in some time. That doesn't mean that if you were to look at history 15 years ago, you wouldn't see that the shoe was on the other foot, right? With regard to the number of right-wing attacks, it was more proportionate to the left wing. We have a researcher that concentrates on the Proud Boys, that is doing ethnographic research with the Proud Boys, but also Antifa, right? And so we view Antifa as an extremist organization that needs counter. They are a violent extremist organization who promotes violence as a means to attain a political objective. They also want to tear down Western democracy, and it's very troubling for us when we see people like Chris Cuomo at CNN get up and defend them. Because one thing I can tell you is that there is very porous borders between the anti-imperialist ideology adopted by the far left and the Islamists' ideology that does, even if it's not Al-Qaeda and jihadists, certainly does view an inevitable outcome where Islam is triumphant and where Sharia law is returned, and it is a totalitarian system that covers the entire globe. And it's kind of really weird to see these people cooperate. And there is like Ilhan Omar is in essence a manifestation of when she was a young girl at the early developmental years of this past 18 years of the war on terror. This was part of the left getting those votes that used to go to the American Muslim community because they were conservative, and now with Barack Obama running, he had to appeal to the, now when he first ran, he couldn't have anybody with hijab sit behind him, right? But on the second term, by the time the second term came around, we were starting to polarize to the level where it was fascinating for us as propagandists, because we're like, this is exactly what we want. We want the left and the right going more radical and polarizing because democracy is never going to work. And they're going to continue to run debt and debt and debt. And they just launched today, while we launched our magazine. Al-Qaeda launched an English language magazine called One Ummah from Al-Shabaab, the core of Al-Shabaab, which the Al-Malahim emblem from Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And they commented in a very well-written piece on the fact that, as far as they're concerned, their war of attrition is working. Charts with economic debt going up and down and looking at the faultiness. We were talking about the bond market. So these are not stupid people, and they're very well aware that a leftist movement that wants to implement a communist, or they don't use the word anymore because it's been discredited because we discredited the ideology, right, to end the Cold War, right? It's a fascinating conversation. It needs more attention, but we have to focus on violent extremism and behavior. Concentrating on the realm of radicalization is something we will do, but again, we have to pick our fights and put our ducks in a row first.
Yeah, so, yeah, in the back, please. Yes.
Hi, my name's actually, I'm a second year economic and political development student. I was hoping you could talk a little bit about, in terms of the magazine, cultivating this grassroots movement. It seems like you're sort of partnering with a lot of sparse, different kind of populations of people. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about cultivating that process, specifically in terms of validating who these people are. You talked about you're working with 8 former jihadists. talk about a little bit of the validation process. How are you finding these people, and whether you can actually ensure that they're acting in good faith for the cause, or just a little bit elaborate?
Well, it's a vetting process. We become aware of an individual who's served prison time, and they're brought to us as someone who has potentially changed their life, repented, and we don't just sort of work with them and say, hey, want to write an article for us, want to partner with us. We really spend time to get to know them, multiple conversations, multiple discussions. Specifically, Jesse, if we're talking about jihadists, is trying to ask them questions that are subtle enough to tease out where are they on the ideological spectrum, to see if their change is really genuine or not. And because Jesse probably knows it better than 95% of the people who adopted the ideology, he's likely to be able to tease that out of these people, so we can see if they've really made the change, or is this sort of instrumental. They say they've made the change for better treatment, so that they're not scrutinized. And we've got a similar process going on with our former right-wing extremists. So there's not an equation for it. It takes time getting to know these people, but we're trying to vet them over time to see that their transformation is genuine. And it's not binary. It's a bit of a journey for them, and we're looking for their trajectory to see that their trajectory is going in the right direction.
We have one more, last one.
Hi, my name is Danielle. I'm a first-year ISP student, and when you talked about your story, you talked about looking for sort of spiritual belonging, which you found through Islam. So I was wondering, what do you think the role is of a society as a whole? So when you're talking about, you're with people within a community that have these shared understandings of ideas, you might be able to turn them back. But what about that 17-year-old that feels lost, and you're giving him these ideas, but around him he doesn't feel that? So what's the role of society as a whole?
So society's role as a whole is to preserve the principles that have developed the massive, it's hard, it's weird for me to say this, right? And so I'm gonna give you the spiel of liberalism, which is you have to preserve it, and it's deteriorating. The reason that you have bullying and frustration and anger is because we've betrayed this ability to respect the First Amendment. It's there for a reason. It's there so that we can communicate with each other and come up with nonviolent ways to address our grievances. And it's there so that there can be a marketplace of ideas, so that the predominantly superior ideas can dominate over the other, but we're split and we're segmented, right? And so in midst polarization is always going to be a lost group. And then you also have to look at economic situations, right? So economic relationships and variables of dependence and interdependence between the economic landscape. It's not the old poor that rebel and that become extremists, it's the new poor. And we have to really look at things like, what is the relationship between rampant discrepancy and inequality and wealth and the perceptions that life is getting worse, and what does that mean for susceptibility to the idea that your people are under threat, that your way of life is being withered, and that the solution is to go back to some pristine past, and then so on and so forth, because it doesn't matter whether it's far right-wing extremism or jihadist extremism or even the incel movement. They all answer the fundamental questions. As a society, I think that we need a paradigm shift in consciousness, and I think that we have the tools to do so, and that we need to really start to look at the world that we're building out for tomorrow, and respect the values that got us here in the first place.
Thanks. Any last words, Mitch?
No, thank you all so much for coming tonight and participating in the discussion. We really enjoyed it.
Yeah, I wanted you just to let you, this was an example of why this work is so important, and these were great questions. These people are available. Keep the conversation going. We'll talk to you after a little bit, give you some information if you want. We'll stick around. And you see how valuable this stuff is. It's really just the beginning of this sort of pushback on the ideological narrative. So I want to thank them for coming.